On the afternoon of March 11th, 2011, alarm sirens began ringing throughout the Tohoku region of Japan. One of the most powerful recorded earthquakes in the world had just struck 72 kilometers off the coast, and a tsunami warning was in effect. The 9.2 magnitude earthquake triggered a powerful tsunami with waves estimated to have reached a height of 130 feet. 20 minutes after the initial earthquake, the tsunami's waves struck towns and cities up and down the coast, and in its wake, nearly 20,000 people lay dead, 6,000 injured, and 2,500 were reported missing. Many victims were ripped apart by the sheer power of the tsunami's waves, and many others were drowned after being overwhelmed by the waters, their remains dragged out to the sea when the waters receded. All up and down the coastline was a zone of wreckage that took 10 years to fully remove. The tsunami was so powerful that it surged up waterways, devastating inland communities unlucky enough to be built on the river systems. In one infamous case, 74 out of 108 students and 10 teachers at the Okawa Elementary School were killed when the tsunami surged up the length of the Kitakami River and overtook their building. Some areas of the coastline are still uninhabited even today, and hundreds of thousands of residents have either relocated permanently or live in temporary accommodations. The tsunami also caused a secondary disaster, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. The tsunami damaged the power station's power systems, causing a reactor containment breach. The backup systems, which normally would have activated in the event of a power disruption, were made inoperable, and with no system to cool the reactor, it went critical. The accident was rated as a Category 7, the most severe, and it is regarded as the worst nuclear disaster since the Chernobyl accident in the 1980s. A 20-kilometer evacuation and exclusion zone around the power station was put into place, with many evacuees having to evacuate several times as the exclusion zone was expanded. For many residents of the region, the difficult decision whether to stay and rebuild or to leave permanently has been a difficult one. For those who decided to stay or had no choice, rebuilding has been an arduous process. Life changed dramatically within an hour in 2011, and they are still haunted by the trauma of losing everything. But the region is not just haunted by the memories of that fateful day. Urban legends and anecdotes shared in confidence speak to encounters with the spirits of the victims, encounters with ghosts of people who don't know they are dead, the angry spirits of animals left behind to die, and other supernatural forces. These are the ghosts of the tsunami. One quiet night, several months after the disaster, a taxi driver was patrolling the back roads close to the devastation zone, seeking out potential clients. It was a clear summer night and the stars were shining, but there was no moon and so quite dark. As he drove, he happened to see what looked like a young woman on the side of the road flagging him down. Pulling over, the young woman got into the back and directed him to an address in a part of town that had been devastated by the tsunami. He thought this was an odd request, but accepted, and they drove off. She was dressed very strangely for the evening, as it was a clear midsummer night and not particularly cold, but she wore a heavy coat which was dripping wet as if she'd been standing in the rain. The woman was very quiet and did not speak, and she appeared to be shivering, again despite it being quite warm outside. As he continued to drive, the surrounding structures became more and more dilapidated, and the cab driver finally asked, "Are you sure you want to go to this part of town? Most of this area is still destroyed." The woman did not answer for a few moments, and in a shivering voice, she suddenly said, "Have I Have I died? The cab driver was terrified and brought the cab to a stop and turned around to face the woman. But there was no one there. A wave of both fear and compassion came over the cab driver, and he carried on to the address the young woman had given. The darkness of the devastated structures around him seemed to become even darker, and he pulled up in front of a ruined house. He got out of the car and respectfully opened the passenger door to allow his invisible client out. Walking over to the steps of the ruined structure, he bowed and said a prayer that the young woman find peace, and silently got back into his cab and drove away. He would pay the fare himself. This is a recurring legend across the region, whispered by taxi drivers and passengers alike. The legend predates the tsunami, with some versions being traced back as far as the 1970s, but the story became more widespread after the tsunami, with so many killed during the disaster. The story speaks to the reality of the sheer number of people who were caught unaware, interrupted in a moment of their lives, and who now all just desire to get home. Rumiko Takahashi lived in the coastal city of Sendai in 2011, where she worked as a nurse, and she was described by her loved ones as a very gentle and loving person. Sendai is a metropolis of over 1 million people, and it's the largest city in the Tohoku region. It lies directly north of Fukushima, and is about a 5-hour journey from Tokyo. Sendai hosted many of the evacuated people of Fukushima, and as the urban legends suggest, is inhabited by many spirits still. For weeks after the disaster, she had been assailed by all manner of spirits coming to her. Rumiko and her family had been unaffected by the disaster directly, living further inland, but for some reason she had been targeted by these spirits. After weeks of harassment, Rumiko and her loved ones finally sought out spiritual assistance and approached a priest. This experience was told to journalist Richard Lloyd Parry by the Reverend Taiyo Kaneda, who was the head priest of Sudaichi Temple in Kurihara, about 30 miles inland and north of Sendai. Kaneda reported that soon after the disaster, people began arriving in droves seeking rites and funerals for their dead. Kaneda himself performed over 200 ceremonies in the following month after the disaster, and his team of monks soon became overwhelmed. One evening, Kaneda received a frantic phone call from Rumiko, and by 9 p.m., Rumiko arrived at Sudaichi Temple with her mother, sister, and fiancé, and the Reverend began his examination. Rumiko was slumped over onto a table throughout the exchange, and something else seemed to speak through her. Kaneda asked the being who it was, and the spirit replied that she was a young woman who in life had come from a broken home, and who'd fallen into the nightlife world of clubs, prostitution, and various other entertainments. In Japanese slang, this is known as the water trade. The young woman had fallen under the influence of a manipulative and violent man, and in desperation, isolated and alone, she had killed herself. The Reverend offered her assistance and took her to the temple room where he recited the Heart Sutra and sprinkled her with water. As the spirit of the young woman disappeared and went on, Rumiko became herself again, and there was no sense that she was filled with anyone anymore. All seemed fine with Rumiko until 3 days later when she returned, complaining that her left leg was in great pain and that she felt she was striving to keep out some spiritual intruder again. This time, Kaneda discovered that she seemed to be bothered by the spirit of a World War II Imperial Naval officer who said he had died and drowned in active duty after his left leg had been hit by a shell. Kaneda again performed the exorcism ceremony, and the old naval officer was put to rest. Over the next few weeks, Rumiko returned again and again with a series of spirits coming forward through her. A total of 25 spirits in turn came forward, all of them victims of a tsunami or somehow connected with water. Usually, Rumiko would call in the early evening, and by 9 PM her fiancé had delivered to Kaneda and his wife. Sometimes up to 3 spirits would come forward per session, seeking help. Many did not know where they were or what they wanted. The recurring themes of the experiences, though, was panic, confusion, and being trapped in a cold and dark place. The tales were all tragic and overwhelming. One of the stories was a man who had survived the tsunami but killed himself later after finding out his 2 daughters had drowned. Another, a pregnant woman who was too slow to run from the waters and drowned with her unborn baby. There was a middle-aged man who came through and was desperate to find his daughter Kaori, who had attended a school close to the seashore. He said he had driven to go and collect her, but was overwhelmed by the waters. He was deeply suspicious of Kaneta at first, but eventually relented to being helped. As Kaneta encouraged the spirit to come to the light, the man said, "I am so cold, so cold. I am at the bottom of the sea with so many others far from the light." Kaneta performed the ritual, and the man was released. Spirit after spirit told their story, and each one was helped to the light. While many of Rumiko's spirits were adults, some of them were children, and even non-humans. In one case, a little girl came forward terrified and ashamed because, during the disaster, she tried to save herself and her little brother, but as the waters enveloped them and they were both drowning, she had let go of her brother's hand, and she was terrified that her mother would be angry with her. Mrs. Kaneta usually took care of these little ones, and she would hold Rumiko's hand as she gently guided them out of the darkness and into the light. One night, a particularly strong spirit came through, that of a dog. Rumiko complained that she was surrounded by dogs, and Kaneda gently persuaded her to let one in. Rumiko was frightened about how strong this spirit was, but was encouraged, and it came through. She suddenly got onto her hands and knees and was growling and snarling until the prayers were said and the water sprinkled. When Rumiko became herself again, she recounted the story of the dog spirit. On the day of the tsunami, the dog and its elderly owners lived a short distance from the Fukushima Daiichi power plant when the call to evacuate was ordered. The dog was chained up inside their home alone, and the elderly couple left in a panic when radiation started to leak, and they never returned. Sometime later, the dog had perceived a man in white coming to peer at him, but it was too late, for the dog had already starved to death and was now a shriveled corpse. It languished in deep anger for having been left behind and forgotten, where it then went on to attack Rumiko. All of these spirits were listened to, supported, and exorcised. Rumiko became accustomed to the influx of spirits, and she seemed to develop an ability to keep them at bay, and the exorcisms became less frequent. She married her fiancé and moved away from Sendai, and Kaneta stopped hearing from her. Stories of spirits possessing people in the region are widespread, and attempts to understand the phenomenon have resulted in explanations ranging from hallucinations, psychosis, people lying, to actual spirit possessions. Whether creations of minds traumatized by the disaster and grief of having lost so much, or the spirits of those who were killed and found themselves trapped between spaces, is beyond the purview of this channel to definitively answer. What is definitive is that the trauma of the earthquake and tsunami is still being felt in the region and all of Japan to this day. And like the ghostly passenger hailing the taxi late at night, so many yearn to return home. Thank you for joining us for this first episode of The Urban Tales. The stories in this episode come from the Ghosts of a Tsunami by Richard Lloyd Parry, a fabulous piece of work that explores deeper the cultural and emotional impacts of this disaster on Japanese society. We at The Urban Tales highly recommend it to our listeners. Join us next time for more stories from folklore and modern urban lore here on The Urban Tales.